Secrets don't die with the people who keep them. They simply wait in the dark for someone to turn on the light. When 34-year-old Emily Hayes inherited her late mother's rotting 400-square-foot cabin on the edge of Oak Haven, Oregon, she thought she was inheriting a worthless burden. Her mother, Beatrice, had been known as the town crazy, a harsh, paranoid recluse who hoarded junk and chased trespassers away with a rusted shotgun. But beneath the mouldy floorboards of that dilapidated shack lay a decades-old mystery. What Emily pulled from the dirt that first week wouldn't just rewrite her family's entire history, it would threaten to tear the corrupt foundations of the entire town apart. Rain lashed against the windshield of Emily's sedate Honda Civic, the rhythmic squeak of the wipers, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of her 4-hour drive from Seattle. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned a mottled white, her mind playing a continuous loop of the phone calls she had received 3 days prior. It was David Ross, an estate attorney whose voice sounded as dry and exhausted as the town he operated out of. "Ms. Hayes," he had said, coughing slightly into the receiver. "I'm calling regarding your mother, Beatrice. I'm afraid she passed away Tuesday. Heart failure. She left strict instructions that you were to be the sole beneficiary of the property on Miller's Ridge." Emily hadn't spoken to her mother in 7 years. The last time they had seen each other, Beatrice was screaming from the porch of that very cabin, accusing Emily of being a spy for the county. Beatrice had always been eccentric, but in her later years, her paranoia had morphed into a terrifying delusion. She believed the town was out to get her, that the mayor, the police, and even the local grocer were part of a grand conspiracy to steal her worthless half-acre of swampland. Emily, desperate to escape the madness, had fled to the city, built a career in graphic design, married, and eventually divorced. She had tried to put Oak Haven and her mother entirely out of her mind. Now she was driving right back into the mouth of the beast. Oak Haven was a former logging town that had slowly choked on its own sawdust after the mills shut down in the late 90s. As Emily drove past the welcome sign, its paint peeling like dead skin, she felt a profound sense of claustrophobia. Main Street was a desolate stretch of shuttered storefronts, save for a local diner, a hardware store, and the First National Bank of Oak Haven. Needing a coffee before facing the cabin, Emily pulled into the diner's muddy parking lot. The bell above the door jingled harshly as she entered. The low hum of conversation instantly died. 4 old men sitting at the counter turned to stare at her, their eyes hard and calculating. Behind the counter, a waitress with a name tag that read Brenda stopped wiping down the laminate surface. Emily kept her head down, taking a seat in a corner booth. "Just a black coffee, please," she murmured as Brenda approached. Brenda poured the coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the chilly air. "You're Beatrice's girl, aren't you?" Brenda asked, her voice lacking any trace of sympathy. "The one who ran off." Emily stiffened. "I'm Emily, yes." "Shame about your mother," Brenda said, though her tone suggested it wasn't a shame at all. "Folks around here are hoping you're just going to sell that eyesore on the ridge and move on. The county wants to bulldoze it. Arthur Pendleton over at the bank has been trying to buy that useless dirt for years to expand the new municipal park." "I haven't decided what I'm doing yet," Emily replied coldly, dropping a $5 bill on the table and leaving the coffee untouched. The hostility in the diner was palpable. It wasn't just the usual small-town gossip. There was a sharp, venomous edge to it. The drive up to Miller's Ridge was treacherous. The paved road gave way to gravel, and then to deeply rutted mud tracks flanked by towering ancient Douglas firs that seemed to block out the grey afternoon sky. Finally, the trees parted slightly, revealing the cabin. It was worse than Emily remembered. The structure was practically sinking into the earth, a 400-square-foot wooden box with a sagging moss-covered roof. The front porch was half collapsed, and the windows were caked in decades of grime. Overgrown blackberry brambles wrapped around the sides of the house, like thorny tentacles, trying to drag it down into the soil. Emily parked, her boots sinking ankle-deep into the mud as she stepped out. The air here smelled of wet pine needles, decay, and something else, something metallic and sharp. She retrieved the heavy brass key David Ross had mailed her, navigating the treacherous porch steps. The lock stuck, protesting with a harsh screech before finally giving way. Emily pushed the heavy oak door open. The stench hit her like a physical blow. It was the smell of hoarding, of dust, dried lavender, and stale air trapped for months. But it wasn't just the smell that shocked her, it was the chaos. Floor-to-ceiling stacks of yellowed newspapers formed narrow labyrinths through the tiny living space. Mason jars filled with murky liquids and rusted screws lined the windowsills. Every square inch of the walls was covered in frantic scribbled notes pinned up with thumbtacks. Emily dropped her duffel bag just inside the door, tears prickling the corners of her eyes. Not tears of grief for the mother she had lost, but tears of overwhelming despair at the monumental task ahead of her. Beatrice hadn't just died here. She'd slowly lost her mind in this tiny, suffocating box, or so Emily thought. As she stepped further inside, brushing past a tower of 1990s Oakhaven Tribune editions, she noticed something odd. The chaotic notes pinned to the walls weren't random gibberish. They were dates, times, and license plate numbers. Emily ripped one of the yellowed slips of paper from the wall near the rusted wood stove. October 14th, 1998. 2:15 a.m. county truck. License OR 773XYZ. 2 men, heavy bags. She pulled another. March 3rd, 2002. Pendleton silver sedan. Trunk sitting low. Smells like bleach. A chill ran down Emily's spine that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. Beatrice hadn't just been watching the woods. She had been keeping a record. But of what? By the third day, Emily's hands were blistered and her muscles ached with a deep burning fatigue. She had rented a massive dumpster from the next town over, paying extra so the driver wouldn't ask questions about the mountain of trash she was hauling out of her mother's home. She had managed to clear the main living area, revealing the original hardwood floors. They were scuffed, stained, and warped from water damage, but they were solid, mostly. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, eerie shadows through the newly cleaned windows, when Emily started tackling the bedroom, a tiny alcove barely large enough for a twin mattress. She was pulling up a rotting, mold-infested wool rug when her boot caught on an uneven plank. Thump. Emily paused, her breathing heavy in the quiet cabin. She tapped her boot against the wood again. Hollow. She dropped to her knees, running her calloused fingers over the grain of the wood. The floorboards here were different. They weren't nailed down with the rusted, square-headed iron nails found in the rest of the cabin. They were fitted tightly together, practically seamless, but there were no nails visible. Heart pounding, Emily grabbed a flathead screwdriver and a heavy claw hammer from her toolkit. She jammed the head of the screwdriver into the microscopic gap between the boards and brought the hammer down. Crack. The wood splintered slightly, but the board shifted. She worked feverishly for 10 minutes, sweating despite the chill in the air, until she finally leveraged the plank upward. With a loud groan, a 3-foot section of the floorboard popped free. Underneath was a cavity lined with thick black plastic sheeting. Emily pulled the plastic back, coughing as a cloud of ancient dust puffed into her face. Resting in the dirt between the floor joists was a heavy, dark green metal lockbox. It looked like an old military surplus ammunition crate, sealed with a heavy brass padlock. Emily hauled it out. It weighed at least 30 pounds. She set it on the floor, staring at it. Beatrice had never had money. She lived off a meagre disability check and whatever she could grow in her pathetic garden. What could she possibly have locked away? Grabbing a heavy pair of bolt cutters she had bought for the rusted gate outside, Emily clamped down on the brass padlock. It took all her body weight, pressing down on the handles until her shoulders screamed before the lock finally snapped with a sharp ping. Emily threw the lock aside and slowly opened the heavy lid. She gasped, falling back onto her heels. Inside the box, wrapped tightly in clear vacuum-sealed bags, were stacks of $100 bills. Emily's hands trembled violently as she reached in, pulling out one of the bundles. The bills were old, small faces, pre-1990s designs. She frantically counted one stack. $10,000. There were at least 5 stacks in the box. $50,000 in untraceable cash. "Mum, what did you do?" Emily whispered into the empty room. But the money wasn't the only thing in the box. Beneath the bundles of cash lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked and worn. Alongside the ledger was a manila envelope sealed with wax and a strange, hand-drawn map of Oakhaven on heavy parchment paper. Emily grabbed the ledger, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Beatrice's, sharp, jagged, and aggressive. But instead of paranoid ramblings, the pages were filled with meticulous, terrifyingly organized accounting. August 12th, 1995. Mayor Richard Higgins, $5,000, for silence regarding the rezoning of Black Creek. November 3rd, 1997. Deputy Tom Mitchell, $2,500. Evidence disposal from the Highway 9 collision. June 18th, 2001. Arthur Pendleton, $10,000. Hush money. The quarry incident. Emily's breath hitched. Tom Mitchell was now the sheriff of Oakhaven. Arthur Pendleton was the head of the bank, the very man who was aggressively trying to buy this cabin. Her mother wasn't just a paranoid recluse. Beatrice Hayes was the keeper of Oakhaven's darkest secrets. She had been blackmailing the most powerful men in town for decades. The crazy act, the shotgun-wielding, screaming madwoman persona. It was the perfect cover. Who would believe the wild accusations of the town lunatic? And more importantly, who would dare cross her if she had documented proof hidden away? Emily frantically flipped through the pages, reading entry after entry. Extortion, cover-ups, illegal dumping, embezzlement. The entire town's infrastructure was built on a foundation of rot, and Beatrice had been collecting rent on it. Suddenly, the hostility at the diner made perfect sense. The urgent push from the lawyer to sell the land to the bank. They didn't want the cabin bulldozed to build a park. They wanted to tear this place down to the studs to find this exact box. They knew Beatrice had kept a record, and they were terrified of what her daughter might find. Emily looked at the hand-drawn map. It showed the town of Oakhaven, but beneath the streets, Beatrice had drawn a complex network of lines, tunnels, old mining shafts. And right in the center of the map, a thick red circle was drawn over the location of the cabin. Beneath the circle, Beatrice had written, "The entrance is under the iron." Emily's head snapped up, her eyes landing on the massive, rusted cast-iron wood stove sitting in the center of the living room. It was an antique, easily weighing 500 pounds, bolted into the floorboards. Before she could even process the implication, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside shattered the silence. Emily froze, the ledger slipping from her trembling hands to the floor. The sun had fully set, plunging the woods into an inky, impenetrable darkness. Through the grimy front window, the sweeping beams of a vehicle's headlights sliced through the trees, illuminating the falling rain in blinding white streaks. She scrambled to her feet, kicking the loose floorboard back into place over the empty hole. She shoved the metal lockbox, the money, and the ledger under the pile of rotting blankets on the bed, smoothing them down just as a heavy car door slammed shut outside. Emily crept to the window, peering through a small gap in the dirt. It was a dark green SUV. The side panel read, Oak Haven County Sheriff, Sheriff Tom Mitchell, the man whose name was written in her mother's blackmail ledger for evidence disposal. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed on the decaying wood of the front porch. Emily backed away, her pulse roaring in her ears. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was authoritative, demanding. Ms. Hayes, a deep, gravelly voice called out over the sound of the rain. It's Sheriff Mitchell, just doing a friendly welfare check. Open up. Emily looked around frantically for a weapon. The claw hammer was still by the bed. She grabbed it, holding it behind her back, and forced herself to walk to the door. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands, and unlocked the deadbolt. She opened the door just a few inches, leaving the heavy chain engaged. Sheriff Mitchell stood on the porch, water dripping from the brim of his campaign hat. He was a large man, barrel-chested, with cold, pale blue eyes that sharply contrasted with his false, welcoming smile. His right hand rested casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his holstered service weapon. Evening, Emily, Mitchell said, his eyes immediately darting past her, scanning the interior of the cabin. Saw your car out front. Nasty night to be up on the ridge alone. I'm fine, Sheriff, Emily said, keeping her voice as flat and emotionless as possible. Just cleaning up. So I see, Mitchell noted, looking at the massive pile of trash bags by the door. Quite the job. Your mother, well, she was a collector. Held onto a lot of things she shouldn't have. His gaze snapped back to Emily's face, the smile fading slightly. Things that are better off thrown away. I'm managing, Emily replied, gripping the hammer tighter behind her back. Look, Emily, Mitchell said, leaning slightly closer to the gap in the door, lowering his voice. This town, it's got its ways. We look out for our own. But this cabin, it's a safety hazard. It's not structurally sound. Arthur Pendleton has a very generous offer on the table. Cash. You could sign the papers tomorrow morning, drive back to Seattle, and never have to think about Beatrice's mess ever again. I told the lawyer I'm not ready to sell, Emily said firmly. Mitchell's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. The friendly facade cracked, revealing the dangerous man underneath. Some messes, Emily, are dangerous to clean up. You go digging around in the dirt too much, you might not like what you unearth. Or worse, the dirt might just collapse on top of you. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, Emily said, her voice shaking just a fraction. But I'll be fine. Good night. Before he could wedge his boot in the door, Emily slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt. She backed away, her chest heaving, listening intently. For a terrifying minute, there was only silence. Then, the heavy footsteps retreated down the stairs. The SUV's engine roared to life, and the headlights swept across the windows as Mitchell backed out and drove away. Emily dropped the hammer, her knees giving out as she sank to the floor. They knew. They didn't know where the evidence was, but they knew it was here. And if Mitchell was willing to drive up here in the dead of night to intimidate her, there was no telling what he would do when he realized she wasn't going to leave. She had to find out what else Beatrice was hiding. Emily stood up, her fear transmuting into a cold, hard determination. She walked over to the center of the room, staring down at the massive cast-iron stove. The entrance is under the iron. She walked around it. It was bolted down with massive hexagonal nuts. Beatrice, a frail woman in her 60s, couldn't have possibly moved this by herself, which meant the bolts were a dummy mechanism. There had to be a lever, a release. Emily grabbed a flashlight and got down on her stomach, shining the beam underneath the belly of the stove. The floorboards beneath it were heavily scarred, carved with circular grooves as if the massive object had been swung back and forth like a door. She crawled closer, ignoring the grime coating her clothes. At the very back right leg of the stove, hidden in the shadow, was a small iron pedal. Emily positioned herself, planted her boot against the pedal, and pushed with all her might. There was a loud metallic clank beneath the floor. Emily stood up, placed her hands on the cold iron side of the stove, and pushed. The 500-pound behemoth glided effortlessly on a hidden, greased track, swinging outward to the left. Where the stove had sat just seconds before, a massive hole gaped in the floor. Emily aimed her flashlight down. It wasn't a dirt root cellar. It was a reinforced concrete shaft lined with industrial steel rungs leading down into an abyss that smelled of stale air, ozone, and dried blood. Beatrice Hayes wasn't just a blackmailer. She was guarding a subterranean secret that predated the town itself. And as Emily gripped the first steel rung and began her descent into the suffocating darkness, she realized that finding the money was just the beginning. The real nightmare was buried below. The air grew significantly colder with each steel rung Emily descended. The ambient temperature dropped by at least 20 degrees, her breath beginning to plume in the faint ambient glow of her flashlight. The shaft was perfectly cylindrical, poured concrete reinforced with heavy rebar, bearing the unmistakable hallmark of Cold War-era construction. Beatrice had not dug this hole. She had discovered it, claimed it, and repurposed it. After 50 agonizing feet of climbing, Emily's boots finally hit a solid metal grate. She stood at the bottom of the shaft, her muscles shaking from adrenaline and exertion. Before her was a heavy steel blast door, the kind used in bomb shelters, painted a dull, fading olive drab. The heavy wheel lock in the center was heavily greased. Her mother had maintained this entrance meticulously. Emily grabbed the cold iron wheel and threw her weight into it. It spun with surprising ease, a testament to Beatrice's paranoid diligence. With a heavy clack, the locking mechanisms disengaged, and Emily pulled the heavy door open. She stepped over the threshold and fumbled for a light switch, her hand brushing against a modern plastic plate on the rough concrete wall. She flipped it. Rows of fluorescent overhead lights flickered to life, humming with a low, electrical buzz. Emily stood paralyzed, her mouth falling open as the cavernous room was bathed in harsh, white light. It wasn't just a bunker. It was a subterranean command center. The space was roughly the size of a high school gymnasium, its concrete walls lined with towering heavy-duty server racks, filing cabinets, and shelves bowing under the weight of thousands of VHS tapes, DVDs, and external hard drives. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden desk, surrounded by a semicircle of 24 computer monitors and analog television screens. Emily walked forward as if moving through a dream. The sheer scale of the operation was incomprehensible. Beatrice had lived in absolute squalor above ground, eating canned beans, wearing threadbare clothing, and freezing through the Oregon winters in a rotting shack. But down here, she had spent a fortune. The $50,000 Emily had found in the lockbox was just a drop in the bucket. Beatrice had reinvested every single cent of her blackmail money into this surveillance empire. Emily reached the central desk. The monitors were dark, but a faint green light blinked on a massive, heavy-duty battery backup system humming quietly in the corner. She pressed the power button on the main computer tower. Fans whirred to life. The screens flickered, one by one, booting up a complex, custom-built security software network. As the images populated the screens, Emily's blood ran cold. She was looking at a live panoptic view of Oak Haven. There was a camera pointing at the front door of the First National Bank. There was a feed overlooking the cash register inside the diner where Brenda worked. Another screen showed the rear parking lot of the sheriff's station, specifically focused on the impound lot and the loading dock. There were cameras at the town's four-way intersection, at the old logging mill, and even a hidden camera mounted high on a telephone pole directly facing Mayor Richard Higgins's sprawling estate. "My God, Mom," Emily whispered, her voice echoing in the concrete cavern. "You were watching everyone." The town hadn't been out to get Beatrice. Beatrice had them completely trapped in a web of total observation. She was the spider in the center of Oakhaven, documenting every illicit transaction, every midnight meeting, every whispered secret. Emily's eyes darted to the filing cabinets. They were alphabetized. She walked over and pulled the drawer labeled PR. Pendleton. Arthur. She pulled the thick, expandable file. Inside were hundreds of photographs, bank statements, and printed emails. But at the very back of the folder was a single VHS tape, labelled in Beatrice's erratic handwriting with a thick black marker. The Quarry Incident, June 14th, 2001. Emily remembered the entry in the ledger. Arthur Pendleton, $10,000. Hush money. The Quarry Incident. She needed to know what she was dealing with. She needed to know exactly why these men were willing to kill over a rotting cabin on Miller's Ridge. Emily grabbed the tape, walked back to the central desk, and shoved it into the heavy-duty VCR hooked up to the central analog monitor. She pressed play. The screen dissolved into grey static before abruptly cutting to night vision footage. The timestamp in the bottom right corner confirmed the date. June 14th, 2001, 2:14 a.m. The camera angle was high, looking down into the deep, jagged basin of the abandoned Oakhaven limestone quarry. For a few moments, there was nothing but the eerie, green-tinted stillness of the jagged rocks and the stagnant water pooled at the bottom. Then, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A heavy-duty flatbed truck backed up to the edge of the quarry's highest precipice. Emily leaned in, her eyes glued to the monitor. Two men stepped out of the truck. Even in the grainy, green-tinted footage, Emily recognized them immediately. The stocky, broad-shouldered man was a younger Tom Mitchell, long before he became sheriff, wearing a deputy's uniform. The other man, tall and aggressively barking orders, was Arthur Pendleton. They walked to the back of the flatbed. They weren't dumping toxic waste or illegal construction debris. They were pulling a large, heavy object wrapped tightly in thick industrial tarp, bound with heavy metal chains and cinder blocks. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The shape was unmistakably human. The audio on the tape was practically non-existent, just the low hum of the camera's internal mechanics and the faint, muffled crunch of boots on gravel. But the visual was horrifyingly clear. Mitchell and Pendleton struggled with the weight of the tarp-wrapped body. They dragged it to the very edge of the cliff. Pendleton paused, looking around the empty quarry, his face directly illuminated by the truck's taillights for a split second. The panic and cold calculation in his eyes were terrifying. He gave Mitchell a nod. Together they shoved the chained body over the edge. The camera followed the descent until the heavy package struck the stagnant black water below, with a massive splash, sinking immediately into the murky depths due to the cinder blocks. The tape cut to static. Emily slammed the stop button, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She felt physically sick. This wasn't just small-town corruption. This wasn't just embezzlement or rezoning bribes. Arthur Pendleton and Sheriff Mitchell were murderers. Suddenly, a loud, muffled thud echoed from above. Emily froze. The sound had come from the cabin. Thud. Crack. It was the sound of heavy boots kicking in the front door. Emily immediately reached out and killed the main power switch to the monitors, plunging the command center back into its ambient, silent state. She held her breath, straining her ears. Through the thick concrete ceiling, she could hear the faint, muffled sounds of heavy footsteps tearing through the cabin. The scraping of furniture being thrown aside, the smashing of glass. They were tearing the place apart. Mitchell came back, Emily realized, sheer panic threatening to paralyze her. He didn't believe I was just cleaning. He brought backup. She heard a massive echoing crash from above. They had found the cast-iron stove. "Hey, over here, look at the floor!" a muffled voice shouted from the surface. It wasn't Mitchell's voice. It was younger, frantic. Emily knew she had minutes, maybe seconds, before they found the lever and moved the stove. If they trapped her down here, she was dead. She was the only liability left connecting them to the body in the quarry. She frantically unrolled the heavy parchment map her mother had left in the lockbox. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the labyrinth of tunnels Beatrice had mapped out was dizzying. But Emily traced the thick red line originating from the bunker. The tunnel didn't just go out into the woods. It ran directly beneath the town. The red line snaked under the old highway, beneath Main Street, and terminated abruptly beneath a square labelled First National Bank, Vault Foundation. Beatrice had an escape route, and it led straight into the belly of the beast. Emily shoved the ledger, the quarry VHS tape, and the hand-drawn map into her heavy canvas backpack. She slung it over her shoulders, grabbed her heavy maglite flashlight, and ran toward the back of the bunker. Behind the furthest row of filing cabinets was a narrow, dark archway carved directly into the bedrock. It was shored up with heavy, rotting timber. It looked like an old Prohibition-era rum-running tunnel. Just as Emily stepped into the dark tunnel, a loud metallic grinding echoed behind her. The blast door at the bottom of the shaft was rattling. They had found the tunnel. They were coming down. Emily switched on her flashlight, took a deep breath of the stale, earthy air, and ran into the darkness. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. It was barely 5 feet high, forcing Emily to move in a painful hunched jog. The ground was uneven, a mix of slippery clay and jagged shale that threatened to twist her ankles with every frantic step. The heavy timbers holding up the earthen ceiling groaned in the darkness, weeping, freezing, mineral-rich water that dripped onto the back of her neck like ice. She could hear the rats scurrying in the periphery of her flashlight beam, their red eyes flashing for a split second before vanishing into the crevices of the rock. But the rats were the least of her worries. Behind her, echoing down the narrow earthen pipe, came the sound of voices. "Clear the room! Find the exit!" The deep, booming voice of Sheriff Mitchell echoed off the damp walls. He was in the bunker. Emily pushed herself faster, ignoring the burning in her thighs and the sharp stitch in her side. She had to keep moving. The map indicated the tunnel was roughly 2 miles long, a straight shot beneath the dense forest before it sloped upward into the town's subterranean infrastructure. For 30 minutes, Emily ran, walked, and stumbled through the suffocating darkness. The air grew thicker, heavier, smelling heavily of sulfur and old sewage as she approached the town's limits. Suddenly, the rough dirt walls transitioned to ancient red brick. The tunnel widened slightly, and massive rusted iron pipes began to run along the ceiling. She had reached the town's old storm drain system, which Beatrice had brilliantly utilised as a covert highway. Emily checked the map by the beam of her flashlight. She was directly under Main Street. The termination point, the bank, was just 200 yards ahead. She clicked off the flashlight, plunging herself into absolute pitch-black darkness. If she was getting close to an access point, she couldn't risk the light being seen through a grate. She felt her way along the cold brick wall, moving silently, her boots splashing softly in a shallow stream of runoff water. Up ahead, a faint yellowish sliver of light broke the darkness. Emily crept closer. The light was spilling down through a heavy cast-iron grating set into the ceiling of the tunnel. She reached the grate and looked up. She was looking into the basement level of the First National Bank, specifically an old boiler room. And she wasn't alone. Standing just 10 feet away, directly above the grate, were the shiny leather dress shoes of Arthur Pendleton. Beside them were the mud-caked boots of Mayor Richard Higgins. Their voices drifted down through the iron bars, crisp and clear in the echoing basement. "Mitchell just called," Pendleton was saying, his voice strained and panicked. "He breached the cabin. The girl found the vault. She found the bunker, Richard. Decades of that crazy bitch's hoarding, files, tapes, everything." "Did he get her?" Mayor Higgins demanded, his voice shaking. "No, she slipped into the old mining tunnels before they got down the shaft." Pendleton snapped, pacing back and forth, his dress shoes clicking sharply on the concrete floor. "Mitchell and his deputies are sweeping the tunnels now. But if she makes it out, if she takes those tapes to the state police—" "Calm down, Arthur," Higgins said, though he sounded anything but calm. "The tunnels only exit by the old train depot and the gorge. We have men stationed at both. We'll catch her. And when we do, we tell the press she was tragically crushed in a cave-in while exploring her mother's dangerous property." "And the evidence?" Pendleton asked. "Mitchell poured 20 gallons of gasoline down that shaft," Higgins replied coldly. "As soon as he confirms his men are out of the tunnel system, he's dropping a flare. We're going to burn that bunker until the concrete cracks. The evidence burns with the cabin." Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, tears of terror and rage stinging her eyes. They were going to burn her mother's life's work. They were going to destroy the proof of the quarry murder, the bribery, all of it. And they were actively hunting her down to bury her alongside it. "What about the ledger?" Pendleton asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The main blackmail book. Beatrice always told us she kept a physical copy of every transaction off-site. If the girl found that—" "The girl doesn't know what she's dealing with," Higgins spat. "She's a city graphic designer, Arthur. She's terrified. She's running blindly in the dark. Mitchell will snap her neck in those tunnels and leave her for the rats." Emily's grip tightened on the canvas strap of her backpack. Inside pressed the heavy weight of the ledger and the VHS tape. Higgins was wrong. She wasn't just a terrified city girl running blindly. She was Beatrice Hayes's daughter. And she had the map. Emily looked past the men's feet, scanning the boiler room above. In the far corner, practically hidden behind an old rusted water heater, was a heavy wooden door. Above it, an old faded sign read, "Utility Access, Vault Level." According to Beatrice's map, the storm drain Emily was currently standing in continued for another 50 feet, before ending at a secondary ladder that led directly behind the bank's main vault wall. Beatrice hadn't just built an escape route. She had built a back door into Pendleton's fortress. Emily knew she couldn't outrun Mitchell's men in the woods, and she couldn't fight them. But she didn't need to. She had the evidence, and she was currently sitting directly underneath the town's centralized internet hub. Pendleton had heavily upgraded the bank's servers the previous year, a fact Beatrice had meticulously documented in her files. If Emily could get inside the bank, tap into the high-speed server, and upload the video file of the quarry murder to the state authorities and every major news outlet in Oregon before they found her, she could burn their empire to the ground before they burned her mother's cabin. Emily slowly backed away from the grate, sinking back into the suffocating darkness of the tunnel. She didn't turn her flashlight back on. She let her hand graze the wet brick wall and moved forward, silently crawling deeper into the rat-infested dark, heading straight toward the belly of the beast. The hunt was on, but the predators didn't realize the prey had the keys to their cage. Emily waited in the suffocating darkness of the storm drain until the heavy, muffled footsteps of Mayor Higgins and Arthur Pendleton completely faded into the upper levels of the bank. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow dripping of water echoing through the ancient brick tunnel. She checked her watch. It was 3:15 a.m. The entire town of Oakhaven was asleep, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was a ticking time bomb. She crawled forward, her knees scraping against the jagged brick until she reached the iron grate. She pushed against it. It didn't budge. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. She positioned her shoulders underneath the iron lattice, dug her boots into the slick mud of the tunnel floor, and pushed with everything she had. With a harsh, scraping grind, the grate lifted. Emily shoved it aside and pulled herself up into the boiler room. The air here was dry and smelled heavily of fuel oil and old dust. She stayed low, using the massive, rusted water heaters as cover as she moved toward the heavy wooden door labelled Utility Access, Vault Level. She tested the brass handle. Locked. Emily slipped off her backpack and unzipped it. She hadn't just taken the ledger and the VHS tape. She had grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from her mother's toolkit before fleeing down the shaft. She wedged the flattened edge of the bar into the door frame, right above the strike plate. She leaned all her weight into the heavy iron. The aged wood splintered with a loud crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet basement. Emily froze, her heart leaping into her throat, listening for any sign that the men upstairs had heard. Nothing. She pushed again, and the door swung open. She stepped through and found herself in a pristine, brightly lit subterranean hallway lined with polished concrete floors and reinforced steel walls. The contrast between the rotting, muddy tunnel and this sterile, high-tech corridor was jarring. At the end of the hall were two doors. One was a massive, circular steel bank vault, its heavy locking bolts currently disengaged for the night. The other was a reinforced glass door with a digital keypad, behind which sat rows of blinking server racks. This was it, Pendleton's newly upgraded data center. The centralized hub that handled not just the bank's transactions, but the municipal internet traffic for the entire county. Emily approached the glass door. The digital keypad blinked with a steady red light. She didn't have the passcode, and the pry bar wouldn't work on reinforced security glass. She dropped to the floor and pulled Beatrice's heavy leather ledger from her bag. Her mother had documented everything. If Pendleton had installed this system, Beatrice knew about it. Emily frantically flipped to the back of the book, scanning the chaotic, jagged handwriting. December 14, 2022. Pendleton authorizes $150,000 for server farm upgrade. Hires outside contractor from Portland. Contractor stays at the Oakhaven Inn, room 12. Emily traced her finger down the page, reading the microscopic footnotes Beatrice had squeezed into the margins. Contractor uses universal default override during installation. Pendleton is too arrogant to change it. Thinks physical security is enough. The override is the town's incorporation date. 1887. Emily scrambled to her feet and punched 1887 into the keypad. A green light flashed. The magnetic lock disengaged with a soft click. Emily pushed into the server room. The blast of cold, air-conditioned air hit her instantly, drying the freezing sweat on her forehead. The room was deafening, filled with the high-pitched whine of cooling fans and processing units. In the center of the room sat an administrative terminal, a dual-monitor setup with a sleek black keyboard. She sat down at the terminal and moved the mouse. The screen woke up, demanding a login. Emily bypassed the main user interface entirely. Her years working as a digital graphic designer for a tech-heavy firm in Seattle hadn't made her a hacker, but she understood file transfer protocols and network backdoors better than the aging corrupt officials of Oakhaven. She opened the command prompt, utilizing the same default administrator access she had used at the door. She was in. Emily reached into her backpack. She knew a VHS tape was useless here, but when she had pulled the tape from the PR file in the bunker, she had noticed a heavy, black, external, solid-state drive taped to the inside of the folder. Beatrice hadn't just collected physical evidence, she had painstakingly digitized her life's work. Emily plugged the SSD into the terminal's USB port. The drive mounted on the screen. She opened it. The volume of data was staggering. Hundreds of gigabytes of audio recordings, scanned financial documents, photographs, and video files. Every single sin Oakhaven had committed over the last 40 years was neatly organized into folders. Emily didn't have time to sort through it. She opened a secure, encrypted web browser and navigated to 3 different sites: the secure tip line for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the direct upload portal for the Oregon State Police Major Crimes Division, and the anonymous Dropbox for the investigative journalism desk at the Seattle Times. She highlighted the entire contents of Beatrice's drive, all 500 gigabytes. She dragged the massive folder into the upload portals. A progress bar appeared on the screen. Calculating time remaining, 45 minutes. Emily groaned out loud, slamming her hand on the desk. No. Come on, she whispered. Even with Pendleton's high-speed fiber optics, moving half a terabyte of raw data took time. She was trapped here for 45 minutes. Suddenly, the cold, sterile smell of the server room was overpowered by something else. Emily sniffed the air. It was faint at first, but it was growing stronger with every passing second. It was the acrid, chemical smell of burning gasoline and scorched earth. Mitchell had dropped the flare. The bunker was on fire, and the massive ventilation system of the bank was actively pulling the smoke from the underground tunnels straight into the building. 10 minutes passed. The progress bar crawled to 22%. The server room was beginning to fill with a thin, hazy smog. The air vents above Emily's head rattled as thick black smoke began to pour through the grating. The smell was horrendous: burning plastic, incinerated paper, and the sharp bite of accelerant. The cabin on Miller's Ridge was undoubtedly a towering inferno by now, the flames eating through the floorboards and rushing down the shaft to consume the subterranean command center. Emily coughed, pulling her shirt over her nose and mouth. She watched the screen. 28%. Outside the glass doors, the bank's fire alarms suddenly sprang to life. The deafening, rhythmic shrieking echoed through the concrete hallway, accompanied by blinding strobe lights that flashed emergency red through the server room windows. If they didn't know she was here before, they definitely knew now. Upstairs, chaos erupted. Emily could hear the heavy thud of boots running across the floorboards of the main lobby. "The smoke is coming from the vents," Arthur Pendleton's voice shrieked, barely audible over the alarms. "The basement! Check the basement!" Emily's blood ran cold. She looked at the progress bar. 45%. She needed to buy time. She jumped out of the administrative chair and ran to the glass server room door. It was heavy, reinforced glass, but it wouldn't stop a bullet. She looked around frantically for a way to barricade it. She grabbed the heavy iron pry bar and jammed it through the handles of the double doors, creating a makeshift lock. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would slow them down. She ran back to the terminal. 52%. Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded down the concrete stairs leading to the basement hallway. Emily crouched beneath the desk, peering over the edge of the monitor. Sheriff Tom Mitchell burst into the hallway, his uniform covered in soot and mud. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He held his heavy service pistol in his right hand. Right behind him was Mayor Higgins, looking pale and terrified, clutching a wet handkerchief over his mouth. Mitchell stopped in the middle of the hallway, his pale blue eyes locking onto the server room. He saw Emily's silhouette through the glass. "You stupid little bitch," Mitchell roared over the blaring alarms. He raised his weapon and fired. Bang! Bang! The gunshots were deafening in the confined space. The bullets struck the reinforced glass, spiderwebbing the pane but failing to penetrate. Pendleton had paid for top-of-the-line security, and ironically, it was the only thing keeping Emily alive. "She's in the system!" Pendleton screamed, arriving at the bottom of the stairs, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing monitors behind Emily. "She's uploading the files! Get in there, Tom! Break the door! Mitchell holstered his weapon and looked around. He spotted a heavy, red emergency fire axe mounted on the wall next to the main vault. He shattered the emergency glass with his elbow, pulled the axe free, and marched toward the server room. Emily looked at the screen. 70%. She needed 5 more minutes. Mitchell swung the heavy axe. The blade bit into the seam of the double doors, biting into the iron pry bar Emily had wedged between the handles. The impact shook the entire glass frame. Smash! The glass began to splinter, chunks of it raining down onto the concrete floor. "You're dead, Emily!" Mitchell screamed, his face pressed against the spider-webbed glass, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Your crazy mother thought she could play God in this town. And look where it got her. She died freezing in a rotting box, and you're going to die in a cage. My mother was 10 times the person you are, you murdering coward!" Emily screamed back, her voice tearing from her throat. She checked the screen. 85%. Mitchell swung again. The iron pry bar bent under the tremendous force. One more hit, and the doors would give way. Emily knew she couldn't stay in the room. She grabbed the wireless mouse from the desk, keeping her eyes glued to the monitor. 90%. Mitchell brought the axe back for a final, devastating swing. "Now," Emily whispered to herself. She clicked Confirm Override on a pop-up window, grabbed the mouse, and sprinted for the server room's secondary emergency exit, a heavy steel door at the back of the room that led directly into the adjacent bank vault. Behind her, the glass doors shattered with an explosive crash. Mitchell burst into the server room, roaring like a wounded animal, swinging the axe wildly to clear the remaining shards. Emily threw her body through the emergency door, tumbling onto the freezing, polished steel floor of the First National Bank's main vault. The room was massive, lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of safe deposit boxes and stacks of banded cash. She scrambled to her feet and grabbed the heavy steel wheel on the inside of the vault door. Mitchell realized what she was doing. He dropped the axe and lunged toward the vault, his heavy boots pounding against the floor. "No! Stop!" Emily threw all her weight into the wheel. The massive 2-ton titanium door began to swing shut on its perfectly balanced hinges. Mitchell reached the threshold just as the door closed to a narrow 6-inch gap. He jammed his arm through the opening, his thick fingers clawing frantically at Emily's face. Emily didn't hesitate. She brought her heavy steel-toed boot down directly on Mitchell's wrist with bone-crushing force. Mitchell screamed in agony, pulling his shattered arm back. Emily spun the wheel, engaging the locking mechanism. With a heavy pneumatic hiss, the massive steel bolts slid into place, sealing the vault completely. She was locked inside an impenetrable titanium fortress. Emily collapsed against the cold metal door, gasping for air, her entire body shaking violently. Through the thick steel, she could barely hear Mitchell screaming and pounding against the vault. She looked down at her right hand. She was still clutching the wireless mouse. Because the vault was directly adjacent to the server room, she was still within range of the computer's Bluetooth receiver. She couldn't see the screen. She had no idea if the upload had reached 100%. Emily closed her eyes, visualizing the desktop layout she had been staring at for the last half hour. The final prompt, the one that required a final enter command to push the data through the firewall. She held her breath, rested her thumb over the left click button, and pressed it. There was no sound, no confirmation, just the deafening silence of the steel vault. Emily hugged her knees to her chest, resting her head on the freezing floor. She had done everything she could. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait in the dark and see who owned the dawn. Emily didn't know how much time had passed. The air inside the vault was growing thin and stale. The adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving her hollow, freezing, and exhausted to her very bones. Then she felt it. A deep, rhythmic vibration humming through the steel floor. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was the heavy, synchronized thud of helicopter rotors vibrating through the building's foundation. Following the vibration came a series of muffled, explosive crashes from outside the vault. It sounded like the bank's main reinforced doors were being battered down. Emily pressed her ear against the cold titanium. "Federal agents, drop your weapons. Get on the ground. Do it now." The voices were booming, authoritative, and amplified by bullhorns. This wasn't Mitchell's corrupt deputies. This was the cavalry. Emily heard a brief scuffle, the sound of heavy bodies hitting the concrete floor, and the unmistakable metallic ratchet of handcuffs snapping shut. "Clear the basement," a voice barked. "We have a hostage situation reported in the main vault. Get the breaching team down here." Emily stood up on shaking legs. She pounded her fists against the steel door. "I'm in here," she screamed, her voice hoarse and raspy. "I'm the one who sent the files. I'm in here." "Step back from the door, ma'am," a voice yelled through the heavy metal. "We have the bank manager's override codes. Opening now." The heavy wheel on the inside of the vault began to spin on its own. The pneumatic seals hissed, and the massive door slowly swung open. Emily shielded her eyes from the blinding tactical flashlights pointing at her. The basement was swarming with men and women in dark windbreakers with large yellow letters reading FBI and State Police. An agent with kind, intense eyes stepped forward, lowering his flashlight. "Emily Hayes." Emily nodded, her knees finally giving out. The agent caught her before she hit the floor. "You're safe now," he said softly, guiding her out of the vault. As they walked her up the stairs and out into the main lobby, Emily saw the architects of her mother's nightmare finally facing the light. Mayor Richard Higgins was pinned against a marble pillar, sobbing uncontrollably as an agent read him his rights. Arthur Pendleton was sitting on the floor, his face pale and vacant, staring blankly at the handcuffs digging into his wrists. But it was Sheriff Tom Mitchell who fought to the bitter end. He was being dragged out the front doors by 3 massive state troopers, his broken arm hanging limply at his side. He made eye contact with Emily as she emerged from the basement. "She's crazy!" Mitchell screamed, spit flying from his lips. "The files are fake. It's deep fakes. You can't prove any of it." "Actually, Tom," a stern-looking state police captain said, stepping into his line of sight. "We dragged the quarry an hour ago. We found the barrel. We found the bones. You're going away for a very, very long time." Mitchell went entirely slack, all the fight draining out of him in an instant. He was shoved into the back of a heavily armoured cruiser. Emily was led out of the bank and into the cool, early morning air. The sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged peaks of Oak Haven, casting a pale golden light over the town. Main Street was completely blocked off by dozens of flashing red and blue lights. News vans from Portland and Seattle were already screeching into the town square, satellite dishes deploying from their roofs. The upload had worked. Emily had sent the town's darkest secrets directly to the front page of every major newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. She was wrapped in a thick emergency blanket and placed in the back of an ambulance to be checked for smoke inhalation. As a medic checked her vitals, Emily looked out the back doors. A few townspeople had gathered at the police barricades, wrapped in bathrobes and coats, watching the spectacle with wide, horrified eyes. Among them was Brenda, the waitress from the diner. She made eye contact with Emily, her expression a complex mixture of shock, guilt, and profound awe. The entire town had treated Beatrice like a diseased animal. They had mocked her, feared her, and actively prayed for her death. They had no idea she was the only thing standing between them and the monsters running their lives. "Miss Hayes." Emily looked up. The kind-eyed FBI agent was standing at the back of the ambulance, holding Beatrice's scorched, leather-bound ledger in a clear plastic evidence bag. "Our tactical team secured the property on Miller's Ridge," the agent said. "The cabin is a total loss, burned to the foundation. But the concrete bunker below it survived. The fire suppression systems kicked in. We recovered thousands of physical documents, tapes, and cash. It's going to take us years to prosecute everyone involved. Oh. The agent looked down at the ledger, then back at Emily with a look of deep respect. Your mother. I've never seen an intelligence operation this thorough. She took down a criminal empire from a rotting shack in the woods. She wasn't crazy, Emily whispered, fresh tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She was just paying attention. That she was, the agent agreed softly. In the weeks that followed, the town of Oakhaven was torn apart and stitched back together. The FBI's investigation resulted in over 40 arrests, ranging from the local police force to the county zoning board. The body in the quarry was identified as a whistleblowing environmental inspector who had tried to expose Pendleton's illegal dumping practices 2 decades prior. The $50,000 Emily had found in the initial lockbox was seized as evidence, but the state eventually released the title of the land on Miller's Ridge entirely to her, free and clear of all local liens. Emily didn't sell the land to the bank. Instead, she had the charred remains of the cabin cleared away. She hired a crew to fill in the bunker and the tunnels, sealing the dark history of the town forever in the earth. In its place, she built a small, beautiful public memorial garden overlooking the valley. At the center of the garden, she placed a simple bronze plaque mounted on a massive stone from the local quarry. It read, "In memory of Beatrice Hayes. She saw the truth in the dark, so we could live in the light." Emily moved back to Seattle, returning to her quiet life, her graphics job, and the dull roar of the city. But sometimes, when the rain lashed against her apartment window and the sky turned a bruised, stormy grey, she would pour a cup of black coffee and look out over the skyline. She knew that beneath the polished exterior of the world, there were always secrets waiting to be unearthed. But she also knew that as long as there were people brave enough to turn on the light, the darkness could never truly win. And that brings us to the end of this unbelievable dark journey into the heart of Oakhaven. Emily's inheritance wasn't just a crumbling cabin. It was a heavy, dangerous legacy that exposed the horrifying truth of a town built on lies, extortion, and buried secrets. Who would have thought that the town crazy was actually the only one holding the puppet strings all along? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. Have you ever found something shocking in an old family home? Let me know down in the comments. I love reading your stories. Don't forget to share this with your true crime and mystery-loving friends, and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a wild, real-life mystery. Thanks for watching and stay curious.